Dzień dobry wszystkim. Hello everyone. I would like to welcome all of you here to 20th EMDR European Conference. I would like to welcome not only participants but also our guests from office of the city of Krakow, who are very open to our needs and really supportive throughout the preparation of the conference. From the very beginning, this conference was very special because it's been 20 years since the first European EMDR conference. And for our Polish association, this meeting is exceptional, mostly because this is the first time, really first time, we can host all of you here in one of the most beautiful cities in Poland, historical Krakow. The motto of this conference is connecting people, connecting Europe. And we managed to live up to the motto. As you have probably noticed, this year there are many more colleagues from countries such as Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Lithuania, Romania, Russia or Serbia than before. And these colleagues I would like to welcome most cordially. We are meeting in a very special place, in a city which has always been a friendly place for people to make connections. Krakow has always been a city of scholars and artists. Here, in our old capital, 1364, the first Polish university, Jagiellonian University, was founded. The oldest university in Poland and one of the oldest in Europe. Here studied the man who changed the way we think about the universe, Nicolaus Copernicus, and also Wisława Szymborska, the poet who received the Nobel Prize in 1996 for her writings, Krzysztof Penderecki, one of the 20th century greatest composers, John Paul II. I think that he doesn't need introduction. Those fans of science fiction literature most likely know also the works of Stanisław Lem, who before becoming a writer studied medicine here. And this list could go on. Kraków always connecting people. Thanks to the unique atmosphere of the city, it offered the opportunity to coexist people of different nationalities, social class or views. People from all around the world settled here. And I'm not sure if our Italian colleagues may have heard that for several decades an Italian queen lived here, Queen Bonesforza, the wife of our King Sigismundus the Old. She had a great influence on the development of Krakow and also on all our country. Paradoxically, although Kraków has never been affected by war to extent similar to other Polish cities and is regarded as the most conservative and traditional city in our country, it has always been the focus of artistic and scientific avant-garde. This paradox results sometimes in an amusing situation. Even 100 years ago, local artists had the status of celebrities. Similarly to what can happen today, Krakow residents were so curious about the life of one of the celebrity artists, or maybe even more curious about the famous parties he hosted in his house, that they would come in numbers to his doorstep. They would enter his garden and would peek into his windows. This was so annoying to the artist that he was able to work in peace only after posting a big note, "Stranger and unlockers not allowed, beware of the dangerous dog." Krakow artists, as it happens, overcame their life's hardships by creating their unique masterpiece and, like their French colleagues, by drinking lots of absinthe. One place they frequented was a cafe close to the Academy of Fine Arts, very popular with the young artists. A legend says that initially they were a serious annoyance for the owner because they were usually penniless. So for the drinks, they would offer a sketch drawn on the cafe wall or other piece of art instead of cash. Eventually, the presence of the unruly artists and their work became a magnet for the other customer. This has not changed much. The cafe Jama Michalikowa, Michalik's Cave, on Florianska Street looks just as in early 19th and still is the location of many artistic events. Speaking of art in Krakow, one must not forget one of Poland's best and most colorful artists of the previous century, Stanisław Wyspiański, whose many paintings and stained glass windows can be appreciated throughout Kraków. Why am I talking about all of this? Because I believe that sharing this experience of exploring Kraków is a great way to make new friendships. But Kraków is not only art and story. It always taken pride in being open and friendly to the development of science. We in EMDR, since the beginning of this therapy, have attached greatest importance to research. EMDR is one of most intensively developing forms of psychotherapy. For more than 20 years, tens of scientists, also in Europe, have been conducting research on the effectiveness of EMDR and on the processes that occur in the heads of our patients when we use EMDR. In Europe, as in every individual country, in the beginning there was a small group of us, only small group. However, precisely because EMDR effectiveness can be confirmed in scientific studies, now there are tens of thousands of EMDR therapies in the whole of Europe. And speaking of whole of Europe, I mean it as a whole, Western, Eastern, and Central Europe. And actually, although the meeting is named European Conference, it has a much broader scope. For the next couple of days, we will host therapists and researchers from all continents. By inviting the best specialists possible, we aim to provide you with a program that will allow you to develop and deepen your competence, both theoretical and practical. Although officially EMDR in Poland started to develop only in 2008, and our local association was founded in 2012, in fact, EMDR appeared in our country for the first time in 1999, exactly 20 years ago. So now you can understand why this conference is so very special to us here. Those days, and always since then, we could always count on support of our more experienced colleagues, on support from other countries and EMDR associations, where EMDR had the longest story. This is the strength which empowers EMDR not only in Europe, but throughout the world. The fact that no country has to act alone to develop EMDR allows us to help each other and build our own EMDR support network. That power did not come from nowhere. We all know whom we should feel grateful to. Since the very beginning, She has supported us with her knowledge, shared her experience, motivated us, and helped us to become better therapists. I think you all know whom I am talking about. I also think you all know that Francine passed away a few days ago. Isabel probably say more, so let me only tell you that I found it myself very difficult to come to terms with this loss. I believe you will agree when I say that Francine has changed our lives, opened new horizons, and to make the world of our patients a better place. Her power, her trust in all of us made it happen that today we can see here not only colleagues from Western Europe countries, where EMDR has a long tradition, but also colleagues from Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, or Azerbaijan, where just like in Poland, EMDR is only starting to take roots. We will always be thankful to Francine for what she brought to our lives. Our motto this year is connecting people, connecting Europe. We hope that our meeting will really make our relationship stronger, that the conference itself and the unique atmosphere of Krakow will not only broaden our knowledge on most recent research on therapeutic work, but also will help us to get to know each other better as a people, will let us make new friendships, and will let us support each other better in our daily work, develop our competence, and help those who need our help most. So, it reminds me to wish you all a very good meeting, and now I have a great pleasure in giving the floor to my friend, the President of EMDR Europe Association, Isabel Fernandez.
Thank you, Martina. A warm welcome also from EMDR Europe Association. We were very glad to see all the description of the history of this beautiful city. Since we got here, we really fell in love with Krakow. So I think we're really happy to be here and to have this conference and with our Polish colleagues. So I would like to start sharing with you some developments in our field since the last time we met. We have had two important publications this year on Nature. Nature is one of the oldest and most important existing scientific journals. It's considered the most prestigious journal of the scientific world. In fact, it has an impact factor of 41.5. And these authors, Bake and Sheen, made a research on the neural circuits underlying EMDR. And this study provides plausible neurobiological explanation for the behavioral effects of alternate bilateral stimulation and by extension of EMDR. Then Holmes highlights and confirms these results in another article of Nature, Brains That Learn Not to Fear. And then in Neuron, another important journal with an impact factor of 14.5, there's a study of Maddox where EMDR is reported as a clinically robust and evidence-based therapy, effective for the rewriting the engrams of the traumatic memories. So another important development are the new ISTSS guidelines published in October 2018 that gave a status of strong recommendation to EMDR for children, adolescents, and adults with PTSD. Strong recommendation means that interventions with a reasonable quality of evidence and the highest certainty of effect are available. So high-quality systematic reviews developed through the Cochrane, NICE, and the WHO, and RCTs from these reviews were the basis of this evidence that are reported in the guidelines. The guidelines say that EMDR has effects on reduction of symptoms, improved functioning, and also in quality of life. Besides this, EMDR was given the status of emerging evidence for adults as early intervention. Imagine only a single session of EMDR within the first 3 months of a traumatic event have emerging evidence of efficacy for the prevention and treatment of PTSD in adults. And then we had a standard recommendation that it was assigned to EMDR within the first 3 months in multiple sessions. So, of course, standard recommendation is higher than emerging evidence. More sessions have more effective. And the same level of recommendation was given to CBT, trauma-focused, and on cognitive therapy. So none of these were considered strong. They were considered standard as EMDR. So then the addition of a research topic in EMDR in Frontiers on Psychology has already more than 175,700 views. It includes articles of EMDR Europe's researchers and clinicians, and the most viewed are these articles, which confirm the interest in these topics. It's about the AIP model and pathogenic memories, and EMDR beyond PTSD has a lot of interest, and also the effectiveness of EMDR with depression. So we had also 4 new countries joining EMDR Europe. These are Malta, Iceland, Georgia, and Lithuania. And some others are coming as observers, like Slovenia, Croatia, Armenia, Czech Republic, and Azerbaijan. And colleagues from these countries are here with us for the first time as observers. And so we can't wait to have them as full members in order to have other countries, other cultures, but the same EMDR language. So last year, I have been re-elected as president of EMDR Europe for a new mandate. So I am very honored to have this privilege again. So in these past 4 years as president, I tried to give back to EMDR Europe everything I have gained from all the people that I have met in these 20 years in this organization. So my clients, my colleagues from EMDR Italy, from the EMDR Europe's board, and also the whole European and international community have taught me so much. So I have also had the big honor to work with the executive committee, which has been working strongly by my side. So I have been able to do all this thanks to these people. So without them, it would have been impossible to lead the huge organization that EMDR Europe has become. I have enjoyed it also so much, and also I have enjoyed working with such wonderful teams. So when I became president in 2015, we had around 14,000 members and 24 countries. Now we have grown to 31 countries and more than 25,000 members. These are all our countries, but as you see, some more are coming in the next future. So we had 2,250 members only in the last year, new members in the last year. So this is the result of the work of many people that were constantly pro bono with passion and commitment for EMDR therapy. So now I'm very excited to go for another mandate and keep working for EMDR Europe with enthusiasm from one side and with integrity in the other side, keeping in mind the objectives of our organization and with our constitution as my guide. So my mission will be to continue working for Francine Shapiro's vision, which was building opportunities for clients and different vulnerable populations to receive EMDR as the best treatment for stress and trauma-related disorders for our members, and for EMDR therapy to have even more prestige in the academic, scientific, and mental health field. So I am willing to take this challenge. I have the privilege to keep leading this organization to a future that we know that will be even more important for EMDR. So I will take it from here to 2023. So, and now some thoughts about Francine Shapiro that passed away on June the 16th. The whole EMDR community is deeply sad for this loss, and she is one of those persons that will stay forever in the history of psychotherapy. I'm sure about that. Her intuition, together with a scientific interest and humanitarian values, is what she transmitted to all the generations of EMDR clinicians. We're now thousands of clinicians all over the world sharing and spreading her gift and legacy to clients, institutions, and to the academic world. There have been hundreds of messages of condolences from Europe, from all over the world, literally from every corner. We have been all connected and feeling close and sharing the same feelings and thoughts. The common message is that people is thankful for her, for the enormous gift to the world, the gift that each clinician donates to their clients in every EMDR session. So in this way, one EMDR session at a time, we're building a better world as Francine wanted. I'm going to show you some images of Francine. And her greatest desire was to contribute with EMDR to peace and well-being in every corner. This is what we will keep doing as EMDR Europe in order to have her always with us. She will continue to live in every EMDR session that any clinician will do to a client. So some days before dying, Francine sent to EMDR Europe a letter for our 20th anniversary. She wrote this letter on May the 29th. It was supposed to be a letter to celebrate our 20th anniversary. And it turned out that now it's a letter with a message with all her legacy and also for her thoughts and orientation and inspiration for the future. So I am going to invite Dini Laliotis, someone that was very, very close to Francine Shapiro. And I'm going to ask her to read the letter. We had agreed with Francine Shapiro that she was one to read this letter for our anniversary. Now she's going to read this letter to all of us. And so, Dini, please.
Thank you, Isabel. As you know, things have changed since I received Francine's letter to read on her behalf, so I would like to add just a few words after the closing, which I'm sure she would appreciate and is very much in line with the conference theme this year. Dear colleagues, I am saddened that I am unable to join you in celebrating the 20-year anniversary of the EMDR Europe Association. Your steadfast commitment to the alleviation of human suffering has resulted in an unparalleled union of 31 countries upholding the highest standards of clinical practice. The ongoing humanitarian programs are a wonderful reflection of your dedication to ensuring that no one is left behind. Research has shown that EMDR therapy can eliminate the negative bias stemming from PTSD that can interfere with mediation efforts. This has important implications for reconciliation and for world peace. Research has also demonstrated that EMDR can eliminate phantom limb pain. The fact that there are no other comparable treatments means that millions of people are needlessly suffering worldwide. It also has important implications for other physical dysfunctions. For the betterment of humankind, we have an ethical responsibility to more fully explore all of the myriad EMDR therapy outcomes by means of controlled research. I know you resonate with these goals since much of EMDR research has been done by your members and with your support. Your organization embodies the very best our profession has to offer, and I hope you are gratified by the knowledge of all of those you have helped. The results of your actions will continue to manifest themselves through countless generations. I applaud you. With warmest wishes, Francine Shapiro. Another reason we are all here together is that Francine Shapiro promoted a sense of community from the very beginning. Before we even had the internet, she published a newsletter with a column titled Stray Thoughts, where she invited us to share our experiences with EMDR, our successes, our failures, and what we learned. She always encouraged us to have a conversation, to exchange our views, to discuss possibilities, and of course, to do something about it. She wanted nothing more than for all of us to share her vision of world peace and to stick together as a community. Her love and her devotion to EMDR therapy to heal lives on in our hearts. That is the soul of EMDR. That is our inheritance. Let's carry it forward together into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dini. This is a very special moment for us, so I would like to ask you to have a moment of silence, a minute of silence, to remember her, to thank her, and to make a prayer with your hearts in any language, in any way you make prayers. So let's take a minute to do this for Francine. Okay, thanks everybody. let's turn to our 20 years of EMDR therapy in Europe. EMDR Europe has to be proud of its achievements. It was founded in a spirit of optimism, universal mental health care, and high-quality training and practice. We have made united efforts to have it recognized, advocating, explaining, disseminating, and we have taken the right steps to get us here. So we have to keep taking care of what we have built. We have taken it so seriously and with so much dedication that EMDR became very, very special. And a page of The Little Prince came to my mind, and it's this. It is the time and care that you have dedicated to your rose that makes your rose so important. And this, I think, represents what we all have done for EMDR therapy with great commitment and care, contributing to make it important. So we have been transmitting this effectively, and now clients and clinicians and stakeholders are the ones demanding EMDR therapy and are looking to EMDR as a therapy of excellence. So let's take a look to our growth in the last 20 years. So these people here, let me see, in 1999, could not even dream of what we would have become in 2019. Talking about the real roots of EMDR Europe, see what we found here. Okay, this is not just a coffee shop in Amsterdam, but the venue of the first meeting of EMDR Europe. A group of people with a great vision gathered together here and wrote the basis of our organization. Our constitution was written there. So they were really thinking of an European association for EMDR therapy. They had to be a model of excellence, being open and inclusive, and promoting networking, founding EMDR communities in each European country, putting research as priority on clinical disorders or on mechanisms of actions, training of clinicians EMDR with the highest standards of quality, promoting at the same time continuous development and ongoing training for EMDR clinicians, and also promoting relationships with institutions, healthcare services, police and military, hospitals, schools, and other stakeholders, and organizing humanitarian and pro bono intervention in acute and chronic phase of collective trauma, disaster relief, and early interventions. And this is exactly what we are today. So this group of friends should be very proud that their vision is a great reality now. Not only in numbers, but also in terms of contribution to our field in Europe and beyond. So the David Schreiber Award this year goes to these people. I am going to ask the representative of the last country joining EMDR Europe to give the award to them. Sima Dirvelite, Vice President of EMDR Lithuania, will be delivering this recognition to the founding fathers of EMDR Europe. Lithuania is the baby of EMDR Europe. Okay. So the first person I'm going to call is Kirsten Berg Johansson for her outstanding contribution to the foundation of EMDR Europe Association. And this is it. Thank you. Thank you, Kerstin. Okay.
Just a very short thank you. I feel very honored. I also want to think about the generosity that I met with the first pioneers that came over to Europe and spent a lot of time and giving us this interesting, fantastic therapy method. So I have been very honored to continue with this. Roger Solomon said EMDR will change your life, and it did. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. So the next person that we want to give this award, and was part of the team, so is Ed de Jong for his outstanding contribution. Oh.
Thank you very much. I didn't expect this to happen, so I didn't prepare anything, but it was a pleasure to build on nothing. We came from the United States, or the United States had an organization, and we want to build one in Europe, and I think we succeed, given you sitting here. Thank you very much.
The next person is Arne Hoffmann from Germany. Thank you, Arne, for your outstanding contribution for the foundation of EMDR Europe Association. Thank you. Yes.
Yes, it's been a long journey with friends, many friends actually. As a German, you cannot go to Krakow without being a transmission of trauma. And I'm just coming from the inner city of Krakow. My wife has been at Schindler's house yesterday, and we prepare to visit Auschwitz on Monday. So, just as a message from my heart, I know there are people in this room from Polish background, Jewish family background. I just want to say, I'm sorry. I don't have a solution for this, but that's what I want to tell to that conference. Thank you very much.
There was a deep, intense applause for you. Thank you. And so I'm going to call another person for his outstanding contribution for the foundation of EMDR Europe, Richard Mitchell from the UK. Sima is going to give you, Lithuania is going to give you the award.
This is a total amazing surprise, especially as I think I might have been up here before, which is quite unusual. But thank you so much indeed. I'm so proud to get this. It's been an absolute honour to be involved in this movement, to be there right from the very beginning and to see it grow and grow and grow and grow and heal all this terrible trauma that somehow is also symbolised in this town of intergenerational trauma. And what Arna just said, it's wonderful and is going to continue.
Thank you. Thank you. The next person is Birgit Schulz from Denmark, and I don't know if she's here. She probably didn't make it. I want to thank also some other people that were in that group, and they're not here now for different personal and health issues. One is Johnny Spearings from the Netherlands. She was there. And Franz Ebner from Germany, he was there as well. And John Spector from the UK, he was one of the founders as well. I think we would like to give another thank you to them, to all of them, and the fact that Lithuania, which is the new entry, will benefit from everything that has been done in these 20 years, and the next generations will take, of course, on for the next years. So we would like to have a picture from all of them. So Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, and Denmark. Those were the ones that were our founding fathers, right? Thank you. And mothers, and mothers. Okay, thank you. Thank you, thank you again. And there's a special also tribute to Desmond Poole from Ireland, who passed away last year. He was one of the founders as well. So, old times, I hope you can still recognize these people after so many years of hard work. You will see this was Francine Shapiro, right, in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam in 1996. I think it was the first EMDR training she did here. Then she was in Cork in 1998. She was invited at the CBT conference of the European Association of CBT as a keynote speaker in Cork. She was always she came to Europe many times. She attended also some EMDR Europe conferences. This is still Cork. I don't know if you know some people here. I mean, this one, who's that with the mustache? And this young boy, Derek Farrell Hill. Okay. And Cindy and Camilla and other friends, and Roger Solomon. And this is Milan and Kirsty. And what about this? Oh my God. Marianne from Norway, and Udi, and Peter, I think it's Peter Lieberman. What do you think? Is that Peter Lieberman? God, oh my God. Okay. And this is an EMDR Europe conference in Rome in 2003. Stockholm, EMDR Europe conference in 2004. And Milan, 2005. And these are some meetings of the board of EMDR Europe. And this is Madrid, 2012. We just selected some pictures. And this is Francine again in Amsterdam in 2009. Francine came to Brussels in 2005 to our EMDR Europe conference, Amsterdam 2009, Edinburgh 2014. And as you see, she really enjoyed coming to our conferences. So before turning to our keynote speaker, I will leave you with a video representing how EMDR Europe was built 1 year and 1 country at a time. So let me see if it works. Yeah. Okay, I think there's no sound for some reason. Built our own history in every European country. Our history is simple and humble. We walked shoulder to shoulder, and that's how we got this amazing thing done, which is EMDR Europe Association. Thank you. Now, thanks to you all, and I will turn to Peter Lieberman, who will introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Well, you see, I've changed a bit comparing to this wonderful photo. I am really happy to introduce Marilyn Cloyter to you. She is an Associate Director of Research of the National Center for PTSD Dissemination and Training Division at the Palo Alto VA Healthcare Service. She is also a former president of the ISTSS, and she was part of the working group for the ICD-11 on the traumatic stress issue. I heard the first time Marilyn talking at a combined ISTSS EMDR Europe conference in London in 2008, and I have two remarkable memories of this conference. First of all, there was a rally of naked bikers, which impressed me. And then I heard Marilyn, after, of course, having read her articles on the importance of person-centered treatment, which sometimes is also called stabilization. So dealing with complex PTSD can always be quite challenging, and not everybody is the same. And I think for the merits of Marilyn is that she really thought about how to help these kind of people in a better way. My only concern is she is not such doing often EMDR as I would hope, but still okay. So, but I like to quote Francine in her last book when she's talking about complex PTSD. And she is also saying other research has supported these findings, like the CSS Expert Clinician Survey, which was an article by Marilyn, and it recommended a phase-based approach with preparation before engaging in trauma processing. But, as you also know, these guidelines have recently been distributed by also at the Young and others too. So working with this special group is still a controversial theme, so I'm really glad that Marilyn is here, and please welcome her and look what she has to say.
Excuse me. Oh, okay. And can you tell me how to move the slide forward? Right here. Okay, thank you. Hello. It is my pleasure to be here at EMDR Europe's 20th anniversary in this very beautiful hall. I want to talk today not so much about complex PTSD, but I think something larger and perhaps more important, which is the relationship between social bonds and traumatic stress. And I think over time it became very clear to me that social bonds are a resource that play a critical role in managing adversity, and that traumatic stressors deteriorate these social bonds. And I would like to argue in particular that childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse particularly deteriorate these very important bonds in childhood. And over time, watching the research grow on this, it came to me that it's very important for us to rehabilitate our social bonds. And partly as a result of this understanding, I developed a program called STARE, which is Skills Training in Affective and Interpersonal Regulation. And I want to say a couple of words about Francine. We didn't live too far apart from each other. I live in California, in San Francisco, and Francine lived about an hour away, up north in Sebastopol, and we had reason to talk to each other on the phone every once in a while. And one thing about Francine was that she was very warm, and you felt when you talked to her, she listened very carefully, and it was very easy to feel a social bond with her. And so I especially like that today, this conference is about connection, this talk is about social bonds, and I would like to give this talk an appreciation to a person who was very easy to have a social bond with. And the last thing I want to say is that Francine who was a very encouraging, warm person, said, you know, you should put STARE and EMDR together. And I said, well, Francine, actually it is happening in the Netherlands. There is a study now putting together STARE and EMDR. So you'll learn a little bit about STARE today. And the other thing I want to mention today is that I am actually, while I have been living in New York City, I've been living in San Francisco for 10 years or so. I actually was born and raised and married and had my child in New York City and lived through 9/11 in New York City, and learned a lot, as we all should, after we experience a trauma. So part of what I'm going to talk about today is informed by that experience. So I want to begin at the beginning. This is a very basic definition of what trauma really means. And I think Chris Courtois was the first to point out that Freud actually used the word trauma from the Greek root of a word meaning wound. And he developed a parallel. Instead of just thinking about physical wounds, he created the parallel to psychological wounds. And I think it's very important for us as we go forward to think about what psychic trauma is. And when you look up in the dictionary the meaning of the word physical trauma, the definition is above. Let me see if I can actually handle this. Yes. The body has been suddenly damaged by a force so powerful that the body's natural protections are unable to prevent injury. And I think the parallel to psychic trauma is the expectation that when things come forward to us that are difficult, we are really resilient beings. And trauma only occurs when the wound is so great that the body's natural healing abilities are inadequate to resolve the injury without medical assistance. I think that means that human beings are naturally resilient, but sometimes trauma, trauma by definition means the necessity of other human beings coming to support you. And I think that psychic trauma also means the same thing. I'm not sure Freud, given how he thought about the dynamics of the mind, intended this particular implication, but I do think the parallel holds, which is that when we think about psychic trauma, I think what we should understand is that its recovery needs the presence of another human being. Okay. So I want to tell you a little bit about my own life. This is a sort of autobiographical sketch in photographs. So this is my jolly husband having fun. This is him being Santa Claus. This is the experience in 1964 of me going to the World's Fair. This is my son, very frighteningly at the age of 4, going on a tube ride. This is myself and my sister graduating at age 13. And this is my son graduating from kindergarten. And then something happens. This is 9/11, and this is a picture of what happens when a trauma happens, right, to an individual. It's something that takes up a lot of space in your mind and makes accessing other kinds of events difficult. But over the course of time, you think about the event, you evaluate it, you try and make sense of it, so that in the end, it becomes just one of many memories. And I think that's the natural process of resolution of trauma. Some of us do it by ourselves, others of us need help, or depending on the size of the trauma or the magnitude or the chronicity of it, we need help to put the story together in a way that creates a life full of both positive and negative events. So I want to talk a little bit about what models or theoretical principles have been dominating the 20th century thinking about trauma. And one is, and both of them tend to be cognitive behavioral models, right? One is exposure therapy, where we've come now to understand trauma as PTSD, which is a conditioned fear response, which is resolved via repeated imaginal or in vivo exposure. The other formulation is cognitive therapy, where it's believed that PTSD results from trauma-generated cognitions, which are maladaptive, and recovery here involves reappraisal or adjustment of these beliefs. And what I want to present to you today is an alternative model, an old model, but one I think that's very useful as an umbrella concept, which is that trauma is essentially a resource loss, right? We lose social, emotional, and identity-related resources following a trauma, right? Social resources, the sense of connection to others. So, for example, after 9/11, there was a huge loss of social fabric. Part of it was because many people died, 3,000 people died. The other part of it was that some people were feeling so bad they couldn't connect to one another. And lastly, many people, because they lost their home or they lost their job, left the city. So it was a huge fraying and loss of resources where people used to be able to come together and solve problems. There were many fewer of them there to do so. The second kind of resource loss is an emotional resource, the ability to manage emotions, right? After this event, you'd see people falling down in tears, not responding well to various kinds of bad news. And the third loss is a sense of loss of mastery, maybe competency or goodness. Whoops. And what you see here is a firefighter during the first couple of days, where there was a huge loss in the first responder community of a sense of mastery. You know, when we worked with these people, there was nobody to save because everyone died. And they just couldn't do their job. And they felt very bad about that, that somehow their capacity to respond to a traumatic situation, which was to use the skills they had, wasn't there because there was nobody to help. Here's an example of some research done in Israel with Stephen Hopful and other people, where they looked at resource loss across time amongst Palestinians over the course of 1,200 Palestinians over the course of 12 months. And what you see is after a bombing, a missile bombing, there was a certain level of people who developed PTSD, but also they took a report from the Palestinians of what kind of losses they'd experienced. Some was material loss, so that would be a job, a home, belongings. Second was endorsement of a lot of social loss of their network. And third was a sense of psychological loss, a sense of loss of mastery, of ability to manage their situation. And what the researchers found was those who endorsed a sense of loss in any of these categories were more at risk at the next missile bombing, right? And then they continued to study these people and identified traumatic exposure as a predictor and more resource loss. And over and above the traumatic exposure, those who endorsed resource loss were still at risk at time 3 to develop PTSD or first-time PTSD. And this phenomenon is called a spiral of loss. So I started thinking about this, and in my own observation of a lot of fraying of a sense of social connection in New York City after 9/11. He's a good, attentive researcher. I'd always measured social support, not because I understood very much about it or even understood why it was important, but it just seemed to continually be highly connected to all of the symptoms I was interested in, PTSD and depression. Didn't know what it was doing there, but because it seemed to be so integral to these other symptoms, I was interested and I just kept it there. And after 9/11, I sort of backtracked and said, well, maybe I should study this. Maybe I should figure out what's going on. And I went back to the 1980s literature where there was a very strong interest, mostly in social psychology, about social support and mental health. And there were two opposing schools of thought, which I actually think ultimately are both right and work well together. Let me just see. So there was a school of thought that said this thing, there's this thing called social causation, which means that when a person has low social support, let me just see if I go to the next slide. Okay. When a person has low social support and there's a traumatic event, they're much more likely to develop some kind of mental health problem, PTSD, depression, or physical health problems. And now we have a lot of literature knowing that this relationship is true. There was another school of thought that said, well, you know, I think you're wrong. I think that people begin with a problem like PTSD or depression or physical health. And as a result of their disorder, people leave them. This is my little man walking away from his relationship to a person with these disorders. And this hypothesis was called the social erosion hypothesis. And ultimately, I think both schools of thought are right. If you conceptualize this as sort of a spiral of loss, that there's low social support, then a traumatic event comes, and they're at risk. We know through at least 3 very good meta-analysis that the single predictor of developing PTSD, antecedent to the event, is low social support. So that's important. And then I think there's a fair enough literature showing that people actually do leave people who have any of these disorders. And for those of us who study PTSD, we know things like, people with PTSD are irritable, they're aggressive, they're emotionally numb and not responsive, they can be irritating to be around. And we know, studying veterans prospectively, that partners do leave. Soldiers with PTSD, that the divorce rate is highest among veterans with PTSD. So there's truth to this idea. But what worried me was that we allow this cycle to go on, that once a person has PTSD, there is this social erosion goes on, and then their social support is even lower. And we know that most people don't go through just one negative event, but live chronically through multiple events. So we know that this person, like the Palestinian example, is going to be stuck in this cycle of less and less likelihood of getting better. The final piece to this story is thinking about, well, who has poor social support? Who is low in social support? People with a history of childhood abuse, or people who have experienced significant adverse childhood experiences. Yeah? So that's how we put this story together, that people who have childhood abuse or ACEs are compromised in their capacities for attachment, are compromised in their social skills, and so as adults, they are at greater risk for developing PTSD, depression, and physical health. And I think it's one reason why we so often see a high correlation of childhood abuse variables and low social support variables. I'm going to skip that. So the question is, well, how do we fix this problem? And the literature in the 1980s said, well, we can help people by helping them develop social skills. That if you have good social skills, it actually enhances social support in the sense of developing social networks, and it helps people engage and maintain good personal relationships. And then you might ask, well, how do you get good social skills, or what are the parts of social skills that are important? There's a huge, interesting literature now by George Bonanno in New York City at Columbia University, who's done an interesting series of prospective studies indicating that the capacity for good emotion regulation predicts high social skills, good social support, and very positive or good relationship quality. So that's very interesting. So I've set a problem and I've begun to identify a solution. But I want to step back a little bit in terms of setting the theoretical frame and talk a little bit about attachment. And I'm sure as psychologists or mental health providers, many of you understand attachment or have thought about it, so I won't belabor it, but basically Bowlby identified that attachment is essential to survival, pretty much through the protection of predators. When you have a species where newborns and young are vulnerable and caregivers have the job of protecting them from predators, that inbuilt biological capacities to attach to one another is one way to survive and allows the species to continue. Once we understand that, we might ask, well, what happens during the course of the process of attachment? And one of the things that happens is comfort and soothing. That is, the caregiver provides emotion regulation and teaches regulation. And ultimately, the teaching is providing guidance in the development of competence and mastery in the larger world and safe space for refueling. So if you ever have the pleasure of watching a parent, say a mother, be with her child in a playground, the 3-year-old or 4-year-old will go off to the monkey bars. They'll fall down. They'll look at their mom, start crying. The mother will open her arms. They come back. She cleans the cut. She might kiss the boo-boo, put a Band-Aid on it. The child feels comforted, and then she pushes them out again into the world, right? Says, there you go, back out in the world, back to the monkey bars. So it's a process like where the child goes out farther and farther every time, doing better and better, and coming back as needed for refueling to the caregiver, to the, what we often call the safe harbor. The other interesting thing about social bonds is that there is this kind of dynamic interaction between the bond and emotion regulation, that what a parent does is both down-regulate distressing emotions, but also up-regulate, make the child happy. And it seems that this dynamic enhances awareness of another person's emotional state, right? Mirroring, which strengthens bonds and supports communication. So this is an essential human skill for us to feel empathy for each other, to be able to understand each other and what we're trying to communicate to each other. And what I want to say today, which is what I learned from 9/11, and it only took me 30 years to figure this out, maybe many of you already understand this, is that the attachment experience in those first several years is actually the foundations for being a member of a community, for being introduced and being partnered into and a member of a community. And that the initial attachment and what happens when we live in a community have similar functions. That attachment is essentially about the survival of the individual, and that gets translated as one becomes a member of a community as survival of that community. That originally emotion regulation happens in a dyad, but over time happens in a community. And I will tell you as a developmental psychologist that I had appreciated attachment as enhancing bonds, having a soothing function, and provides practice for being in the real world, for doing well. But it was only as a member of a traumatized community that I understand that all of that emotion regulation skill was being used at a community level, where I saw, despite frayed social bonds, a lot of people coming together, that people would take care of each other, right? Soothe each other, that the widows of many of the people who had died in the towers found lasagna plates right on the doorstep, because these were women who often had children. They didn't have time to take care of their families. The community got together, took turns bringing their children to school, took turns providing food for them. And I think the last thing, of course, that attachment does is to help people feel mastery. And I think under traumatic circumstances, the community helps itself regain mastery of a situation. So here are some examples, right? That under traumatic stress, survival is protected. And here, oops, I'm sorry, we have the essential definition of trauma, right? That there are various situations that are highly traumatizing, and by the medical definition, it means that that person will not survive unless there is a person to help them. And we see this many times. And in a way, you know, we live in a community And we don't think anything about it. We don't think, yes, how strange and wonderful it is that we have firefighters, that we have EMT providers, but it is a core part of what it means to be a society and a community, that we are at the ready, intrinsically, to help members of our community to survive, because if they survive, we survive. The other thing I noticed during 9/11 was the incredible amount of soothing that was going on. Taking care of people, because emotion dysregulation means that people can't work well, they can't take care of their children well, they can't reconstitute their homes, and they need others just to help them modulate their emotional states, right? When during attachment, one person does that job for one other person, say a mother to a child. But in a traumatized community, many people embrace the traumatized individual or the traumatized town so they can do better, so they can go out, you know, like the community is the safe harbor they come around and help people so they can getting started all over again. Okay? And the last thing that happens under traumatic stress is that the community helps rebuild, right? These are examples, I think, of an earthquake in the United States and floods elsewhere. That one goal is to help the community stand back on its feet, build new homes, get fed, start growing crops again. Okay, so there's been a lot of neuroscience work looking at the capacity of the single individual to take care of themselves after a trauma. And so here are some studies. This is an example of one study looking at cognitive reappraisal, showing that reappraisal is a key component to recovery from PTSD. But what we also see now is the neuroscience of emotion regulation, or social regulation of emotion. This is one of just a very few studies that are beginning, showing that the presence of another also activates the brain in ways that are important for reduction of arousal. So that not only is this an idea, not only is it something observed, but it's also appears to be something that can be studied and evaluated as part of the neurocircuitry of the brain. So if this is what human beings do when things are going well, and people come together in a community when there's a community trauma, the question is, well, what happens when there's childhood abuse and maltreatment, right? How does the attachment process go awry, and how do people who have a history of abuse or trauma do during adulthood traumas? And you know, I won't belabor this because I think many of you are familiar with this idea, but we know there's a huge literature in the developmental psychology that children who experience maltreatment by the ages of 7 to 11, middle school kids, are doing much more poorly in their capacity to manage arousal relative to children who have not experienced that. And they also are doing more poorly in their social skills as observed by their teachers. They are less able to have communication with other kids. They are poorer in resolving conflicts with children who are maltreated. Do not go to the teacher for help, right? Kids who have no history of maltreatment, go to the teacher for help. You know, like an adult is the safe base. I think what happens here is that children who have maltreated by the age of 7 to 9 have already figured out or come to believe that adults are useless in helping resolve sort of the community traumas, the mini community traumas that go on in the classroom. Separately, in other cross-sectional studies, which I've done and other people have done, we see these same capacities disturbed in adults, and I won't belabor this too much, But what you'll see here are all kinds of emotion dysregulation seen in adults who have experienced sexual abuse, I think, in childhood. So this is rates of alexithymia, 70%. These are about 109 women who were the first series of patients who came to a clinic, a trauma clinic for adult survivors that I had begun like 20 years ago or so. I was just trying to figure out what went on with them. So these are the results of our initial assessments, that they were very high in alexithymia, as compared to women who were also coming to us who had experienced adult sexual assault but had intact childhood experiences, intact family, no sexual or physical abuse, compared to normal controls to which we had them matched. Same thing, very high dissociation. This is DES score of 20 or more compared to adult sexual assault and normal controls. And also ultimately what we all care about, 50% of our patients with childhood trauma had made a suicide attempt compared to about 20% of adult sexual assault compared to none of our controls. And I take the view, like Marsha Linehan, that suicide attempts can be viewed as a coping strategy. You know, that when things get too painful for our patients, they like to hold on to one option that they know will help end the pain. You know, it's a permanent solution, there's no going back on it, so it's not that great a solution. But that's how I link it to emotion regulation problems. Okay, same thing you'll see here. People in orange are childhood sexual abuse survivors. In every different kind of interpersonal dynamic that they reported on, they had way higher yeses to having problems compared to adult onset problems and also compared to our normal controls. Now the interesting thing here was, well, I thought, well, maybe some people have problems reporting on difficulties with intimacy, other people on being too submissive and not properly assertive. So I thought, well, maybe different people have different kinds of problems. But when I looked at the data subject by subject, what was clear was that one person would report problems in all of these domains, which let me know that there was a dysregulation in capacity to manage power dynamics, in the experience of control, and the experience of intimacy. They had problems in all of these domains. So ultimately, as a younger person, I wasn't so interested in diagnosis, you know, not PTSD or complex PTSD. And still, in my heart, what I'm most interested in is, can our patients function in the day-to-day world? So these data here are a regression analysis where we put in the diagnosis of PTSD, at that time DSM-4. And then I said, well, after you control for all of the symptoms of PTSD as it predicts functional impairment, is there anything over and above what you see in PTSD in emotion dysregulation that might add to functional impairment? And the answer was yes. And this analysis is important because any emotion dysregulation as it relates to the symptoms of PTSD are already included here. So we give PTSD the credit. So this means there's something over and above the emotion dysregulation you get from PTSD, which is that irritability, other kinds of problems. And then the third variable we put in is the interpersonal problems that I just showed you about, problems in power dynamics, problems in control, problems in intimacy. And so what this graph tells you is that 50% of the total variance attributable to functional impairment have to do with things that didn't belong to the diagnosis, right? That there's more to what bothers people than PTSD. And so for me, the lesson was, well, we can treat the diagnosis, and that's fine. But when we're working with people with childhood abuse, there are some underlying developmentally based vulnerabilities that have to do with general capacities for emotion regulation and interpersonal functioning that we're not addressing if all we do is focus on traumatic memories. And this is a cross-sectional study which puts that picture all together. This is the first 109 women in our clinic. We did AAIs, attachment assessment interviews by Mary Main, and we identified those who were insecure, and we also had as our outcome functional impairment. And we found that insecure attachment was related to functional impairment through emotion dysregulation and low perceptions of support. So the AAI, as you may know, is the story of a person's childhood. And you can get functional impairment ratings from it. And what we were interested was saying, well, how do you get from an impaired attachment to being a functionally impaired adult? And what we found were that these two characteristics explained a lot of this relationship. So a final question is, well, what do we really know about the relationship between emotion regulation and social competence? And in childhood, there have been prospective studies suggesting that emotion regulation capacities or skills precede social competence. These are studies by developmental psychologists who evaluated emotion regulation in 9 to 11-year-olds, healthy kids in a classroom, and 2 years later looked at their emotion regulation capacities as predictors of perceived social competence, their capacity to engage in conflict resolution, their capacity to have friendships, and social acceptance by their peers. If any of you are developmental psychologists, you know that one of the things that child psychologists do, this kind of terrible thing that they do, is have kids rate other kids on how popular they are. And kids who 2 years earlier were identified as having poor emotion regulation were the kids who were also less well socially accepted as 11 to 13-year-olds. I found this very interesting and held it in my mind, and I was very interested to see a few, maybe 15 years later, some work done by adult psychologists who have no interest, I don't think, or knowledge about developmental psychology. These are studies that were done at Columbia University by George Bonanno and his colleagues, where they were evaluating 18-year-olds in their first year of college, evaluating their emotion regulation in particular in an experimental paradigm. And, you know, college students are a bit of a captive audience. They were able to evaluate them 3 years later in regards to their general mental health, their physical health, their ability to accomplish goals as evaluated by their friends or peers, the quality of their social interactions also evaluated by friends, and the perceived ability to cope. And what was found was that those who were designated by the experimenters as having poor emotion regulation were those who were rated lower 3 years later on adjustment. That emotion regulation, and the other thing they looked at was the intervening impact of cumulative life stressors on the college student. And those who had lower emotion regulation had poorer adjustment in the face of cumulative life stresses, while those who had high emotion regulation and the same level of cumulative life stressors had resilient outcomes. So this reminded me of the earlier studies by developmental psychologists. The other kinds of things that George Bonanno and his group have done, which is also very interesting, is that he pretty much regularly would do these experimental studies of emotion regulation at the beginning of the school year. And in the United States, or at least in New York City, it's late August. 9/11 happened September 11th, right? So he had just finished his emotion regulation evaluations. And then this whole entire group of students were exposed to a large stressor, community stressor. And what he found, let me just see, was that the ability to express positive affect pre-9/11 predicted the size and strength of the social network 2 years later. This means that students would report and other people would report, you know, how many people do you know that you trust? And the strength of it was, what is the quality of your connections with others? A separate study looked at the capacity to be emotional, to express on one's face what is experienced internally. And in this study, childhood sexual abuse survivors were asked to tell about their trauma, their sexual abuse. And I think they were also videotaped. And the facial expressions were coded. And what they found was that people who smiled or who were blank in their faces while they told their stories were predicted 2 years later to have fewer friends than people who had an emotionally in sync expression on their face with what they were saying, right? And we don't know why this is exactly, and there are many things we could imagine, we could say about this study, but I think the general idea is that people who have difficulties being emotionally spontaneous and connected, having their bodies connected with their internal states in a way that's effectively expressed to others, are noted by others to be strange or odd. And they're not the kind of people that others want to help. That's the moral of this story. It's sad, but to me, the lesson as a therapist was we have to help survivors who have problems having their bodies and faces in sync with their internal states, so they can be socially connected to others, so they can feel a part of the community of others. So ultimately the question is, well, where do we intervene? And certainly, you know, it would be great to intervene here before a traumatic event occurs. But many of us already know that it's very difficult actually to get people into preventative care, even if they have risk factors such as childhood abuse. So perhaps what we can do is intervene here. Once a person is identified as having a problem, we can intervene here to resolve the PTSD, maybe go through the traumatic memories, but also do things like help them with their emotion regulation, help them with their social engagement capacities, so that we can stop this part of the cycle, that they don't experience social erosion and possibly maybe increase or enhance their capacity to connect to others. So what are the intervention implications? As I said before, that we should engage social, we should teach people social skills and help them with emotion regulation. And I had given this lecture one other time before, and somebody said, well, do you know that there's this study of exposure, of prolonged exposure? You may be familiar with this therapy. And what the authors found was that the higher the social support, the better the effectiveness of the exposure therapy. And the more likely a person was able to engage in social support during the course of prolonged exposure, the better their outcome. So it wasn't even as if the person, it was a static phenomenon. The capacity to engage in social support, maybe as directed by the therapist, actually improved their capacity to do exposure and benefit from it, which I found was very interesting. So I want to tell you a little bit about STARE, which is the treatment that I've been working on for several years now, which is basically a developmentally framed therapy. I began working with childhood abuse survivors, said, I think there are problems here with emotion regulation, with using emotions appropriately and doing well in relationships. And so this therapy was one phase of a two-phase therapy, where in this phase we focused on emotional awareness, just being aware of what one feels, learning how to regulate emotions, all kinds of strong emotions, or uplifting oneself in a negative state, tolerating emotional distress for valued goals, using emotion regulation for enhancing relationships, and changing relationships in a positive way, using a bit of interpersonal schema or attachment-based perspective, that our goals in the therapy were to help people experience themselves as agents in the world, be appropriately assertive, be flexible in relationships, know that they have different kinds of working models, that you have different expectations and different ways of relating to people depending on who they are. And lastly, really working on that core issue in PTSD is enhancing capacity for closeness and intimacy. And lastly, having compassion for oneself and others as one goes through one's recovery process. I want to tell you that this is only phase one, or one component of the treatment. It is pretty much present-focused, which is intended to increase resources. Its other module or partner is past-focused, where we do narrative therapy, a version of prolonged exposure, where the goal is to decrease symptomatology. But overall, having these two components of treatment together, the underlying principle is to help the person develop a continuity in their sense of self, where they're willing and able to accept their past and willing and able to live in the present. Right? You need to be skilled to find it interesting to live in the present. Many patients have said, well, the past is safer because I understand it and know it better. The present is scary because I don't understand it. I don't understand how to relate to people who aren't traumatized. And so my goal was, well, maybe I should open the door and welcome you to ordinary life and see if you can meet ordinary people and find a community of people you can feel comfortable with. So here is a brief overview of STAIR narrative therapy. It's 18 sessions where we have 5 sessions on emotion regulation, 5 on relational and social capacities, then 8 sessions where we both tell the story and make meaning of it. So there's essentially 3 to 4 components to this treatment. We provide a feelings wheel, which allows people to think in space and color, teaching them that scared is the opposite of safe, sad and joyful are opposing each other, and anger can be transformed in a positive way to feeling powerful. We teach people, well, once you have intense emotions, you should accept them, live with them, manage them, and I now live in California, and so what you'll see here is a surfer. This is an analogy that works really well in California, where a person stays connected but on top of their emotions. So they feel the roiling of the waters underneath, the power and shifts of the water, but they stay connected to it and on top of it. And if they stay connected to the water or to the emotion, it really is the key to bringing them into shore and feeling safe and grounded. So it's really a lesson of becoming aware, on top of, and connected to emotions. We do very traditional Dbt soothing of the senses. We teach people that different people need different ways of being responded to, and they practice interacting in various videos and making judgments about how they might respond to a person who's being very demanding of them, if they were their partner, if they were a friend, if it was their child, if it was their coworker, and if it were their boss. The idea that different reactions are required for different relationships depending on power dynamics and closeness. It's educating people to do things differently. Not one single rule works, which is a challenge. We do some closeness work. What's wrong with this picture? Can you identify problems in intimacy and some of these interactions with couples that we show? What couples are doing well in their closeness, and why are they doing well? Can you identify what's going well? And ultimately, some self-compassion work, which I think is very important to what we do. And I just want to read this out a little bit, where basically we ask people, instead of thinking of themselves as all terrible or all wonderful at different times, we ask people just to imagine that the positive and negative parts that represent yourself no longer fight against each other, but actually allow yourself to hold all of these pieces together and focus on what this experience feels like. And we do this exercise to prepare people to do well as they tell the stories of their childhood, right? Where they can have compassion for themselves. They're going to be telling very hard stories about themselves. And we want them to feel compassion for what happened to themselves, as well as the people who are in the stories. The evidence base for stare narrative therapy, I'm not going to probably go into detail here, but there are 3 randomized controlled trials now of stare compared first to waitlist, stare compared to its component parts, and most recently, stare narrative compared to treatment as usual in public sector settings, which is under review. And I'm going to skip this because I think I might be running out of time. But our summary of findings was that the combination treatment produced greater reduction in PTSD, greater improvement in emotion regulation, interpersonal functioning, less symptom exacerbation at the beginning of the narrative work, and lower dropout rates than a treatment which removed the active ingredient of stare, replacing it with supportive counseling, or removed the exposure piece and put in supportive counseling. So basically the lesson that we learned was it's better to have both things in a treatment than only one or the other. What we're recently doing is looking at stare alone. And part of this is because I now work for the VA, Veterans Administration in the United States, and they have already tons of good exposure therapies. And to me, the only thing they were missing was a resource enhancement treatment. And people said, oh yeah, Kloitra, go ahead, you can do this. Just leave our exposure therapies alone and see how far you can get with doing these resource enhancement treatments. So this is the results of a study that's just completed, where we took stare alone, 6 sessions versus treatment as usual in primary care. And these are the effect sizes: 0.91 for PTSD, 0.87 for depression, emotion regulation, very high, 0.87, and social engagement, 0.87, as compared to treatment as usual. Now in VA, what does treatment as usual mean? Treatment as usual means that a person is referred to mental health services where they don't go. So this, or they get some social support or referral to medication where they often don't go. So treatment as usual is kind of a mix of kind of nothing or a little bit of a mental health intervention in primary care and a referral to mental health that they don't use. And so I think one of the important things for us to think about in the future is for EMDR, for stare, can we bring these interventions into places where we find a lot of patients, which is primary care? Can EMDR therapists, can stare therapists be present in the doctor's office in big community settings? I noticed that there is an effort to increase access to care in EMDR, and I'm wondering, well, might this be a place to go? Okay. We're also using stare via telemental health. Women veterans do not like coming to the VA, particularly those with military sexual trauma, meaning that they were sexually assaulted during their time in service, typically by fellow soldiers or by their superiors. Now, we had very high effect sizes in an open trial, 2.3, 1.8, 2.3, 1.4, very high. Now, of course, this is just an open trial, which means that all of the women who participated actually raised their hand and said, I want to do this therapy. So we will never see results like this again, or we shouldn't. But it did lead us to getting a grant, which is a newly funded 4-year study looking at stare alone versus presence-centered therapy for women with veterans with military sexual trauma. We've also been using telemental health to use our web-based treatment. So this is an example of our web-based program and a therapist and a patient working together, seeing each other simultaneously with working through the web. One of the issues that we have, at least in VA, and I think probably for all mental health care, is that people who live in rural areas don't get to see providers. People who have kids or have jobs or just don't like the feel of a doctor's office don't come to care. So if they can't come to us, can we come to them, meet them where they're at? And it looks like the answer is yes. These are some data looking at web stare with a therapist, and we see in an open trial very good reductions in emotion regulation problems, less so, but significant reductions in interpersonal problems. And the same thing actually happens with PTSD. So where do we go in the future? And I think we've had some conversation, Ad de Jong has been involved in this, saying, well, is there anything that's necessary to do in treatment? And I think the answer is no. There is no single treatment component that is necessary for care. And so you'll see here, this is all part of STARE. We have emotion regulation, we have relationship and social function, we have exposure to memories, we have meaning appraisals. These are all components of good therapy. And one thought, as we go into the future, is perhaps to personalize our psychotherapies, meaning match interventions to patient problems. Identify patient problems in terms of their clinical significance and their relevance to the patient. Select an intervention that we begin with that addresses this problem. Reassess and repeat. So if a person comes in and says, well, I have nightmares, but they don't really bother me. I'm really worried about my relationship with my spouse. Or if a person says, well, I'm really bothered, here you might do an interpersonal intervention first. If a person says, I'm having nightmares and re-experiencing symptoms, you might say, you know what might help is just talking about the trauma, imagining it, doing some kind of exposure therapy or cognitive reappraisal. If a person says, I'm just so emotionally dysregulated, I get angry all the time, or I feel anxious all the time, I'm just sad all the time, a therapist might say, well, you know what? Let's start working on your emotion regulation. We know in VA that only 10% of patients who have PTSD actually go into a PTSD treatment. Why is this? It's not because the treatment isn't good, it's because we're not engaging the patients in a way that I think respect and respond to what it is they want help with. And I think we can do that. It's not that hard. It's just meeting them where they're at. So I think I'm going to skip this. I want to say that, you know, I pay attention to child psychologists. They've been doing this kind of modular treatment for a long time because one thing we know about children, and I lived in a child psychology department for 10 years, is that they're not neat and clean and organized. They experience a lot of different kinds of problems. Sometimes they have conduct problems, sometimes they have anxiety, sometimes they have depression. Where do you start? What does the child psychologist say? You start with the problem that's most impairing, and you decide that between the therapist, child, and parent. And I'm thinking, well, why don't we do the same with adults? And let's see how well the child psychologists have done on sort of modularizing treatments and ordering them according to the patient's needs. And that's what you'll find here in a series of beautiful studies. They've shown that modular approaches outperform standard EBTs, that modular approaches outperform usual care, and importantly, I think for dissemination of a modularized approach, that therapists really like this. They have high satisfaction for the modular treatment. And I tried very hard to look at these studies and say, well, what do the patients think? And there was no report on patients. And it might be because it's hard to know in child work who the patient is. Is it the child or is it the parent? But we'll see if they come forth with this data. So I'm going to stop there. I think in addition to modular treatment, what else can we do? Maybe we can follow the patient preference about where they want to start. We have a report, here that 50% less dropout occurs in patients who receive their preferred treatment. We know we have good treatments. One problem is engaging them. So doing modular treatments might be the approach. Another problem we have is that patients drop out. Well, maybe starting with the treatment that they prefer or the approach they prefer will keep them in. And the last thing I want to mention is select skills that capitalize, not compensate. This is work that's done in depression, where it's been shown, you know, you could choose, if you have a patient who has a problem with emotion regulation, you could choose a compensation approach, which is, I'm going to teach you a new skill. The alternative is capitalization, which is, let's see where your skills are, and let's grow them and enhance them. And the question that these researchers asked is, which approach results in improved outcome in depressed patients. That is, how much does their depression go down? Whether you use a capitalization approach, let's begin with the skills you know, versus compensation. Let's start you on a new skill where you seem to have deficit. And I thought the results were kind of counterintuitive, but it's capitalization. Begin with the patient's strengths. So when we do STARE, we always begin with, what are you good in? Oh, you like knitting. Oh, do you find that soothing? Maybe you can do more of that. So in thinking about future directions, what are our tasks here? And I think already EMDR Europe is involved with this, and these things were mentioned earlier, which is doing things as follows: increasing access to care, increasing venues convenient to patients, using Skype and smartphones. I actually, before this conference, looked up EMDR on apps. There are at least 4 different EMDR apps, and I'm going to check them out. To improve outcomes. In the most recent ISTSS guidelines, although they're not in them, basically our rates of improvement show that only, maximally, optimally, 50% of people resolve their disorder. So we have a lot more work that we can do to help our patients. And the last thing is to reduce burden, right? We work so hard, there are so many people that are suffering. Can we increase attention to children and youth? Let's start at the beginning where many problems start. Invest in preventative interventions, and also address refugee mental health. I think these are all things, work that we need to do in the future. There's so much work to be done. That's all I'm going to say now. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for this talk. And we still have time for some questions. Do you want?
Well, I could say a little something based on my conversations with Francine, because I'm not trained in EMDR. But we were having a conversation about one of the things that I so admired about EMDR therapy, which is that it asks a person not only to reflect on the trauma, right, but also positive events and positive emotions and positive experiences. And I think in that way does a couple of things. I think 1, really facilitates an integrated sense of self, and 2, allows the person to have the experience in the moment in the session of experiencing something both positive and negative, and knowing that they can manage both of those things. So that's my very naive assessment of maybe a mechanism of action for improvement in emotion regulation EMDR.
Okay, so
well, thank you very much.
Thank you for this talk. Mm-hmm. And even if it's difficult to take flowers back.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the sense of warmth and community that there is here, and I think it does express a way of being that Francine represented so well. So thank you.
So this is the end of this opening. Please, you are welcome to join the welcome party. We have time to talk, to get together, and maybe also think about Francine a bit. And I think she would appreciate everything she heard during this opening. And on a personal level, I would really like to thank Arne Hoffmann, what he said, as I lost so many of my relatives in Auschwitz. So thank you.
Merci beaucoup.